All right. And our second speaker, Sarai Sanchez, is a graduating senior in art history and global cultures. Her recent research has focused on the iconographies of Latin America, including colonial era European imagery, and how such images have been reinterpreted and visually refigured by indigenous, diasporic, and Chicano communities. She plans to continue on to graduate school in art conservation and use her scholarly and artistic skills behind the scenes in museums. So welcome, Sarai. Thank
you, and good afternoon, everybody. Most of you may be familiar with the name Guadalupe. She goes by many names: La Virgen, Nuestra Señora, Donantzin, Madonna, Our Lady, Mother Mary. This usually depends on geography, but above all, she is recognized as giving birth to the Son of the Christian God, Jesus Christ, and has been an essential part of the Catholic faith for centuries. Catholicism and Catholic iconography were brought from Europe to the Americas in the mid-16th century. Guadalupe, as I refer to her through a majority of the presentation, has taken many forms through art pieces across different continents, which allowed her to endure and adapt to the changes brought by time. I will discuss how Spanish control in the Americas imposed Catholicism upon the indigenous of New Spain, which allowed a reinterpretation of iconography, such as the Virgin Mary, in the 20th century America, where we see evidence of colonial imposition being reconceptualized and reclaimed in Mexican-American art from artists Yolanda Lopez and Amal Lopez. Her beginnings in New Spain reflected the same ideals that stem from the ideas that surrounded the Virgin in European renderings prior to Spanish conquest. In Europe, we get pieces like Michelangelo's Pieta, 15th century. Here, Mary is depicted holding her dead son in her lap like a mother does when her child is born. First thing I noticed understanding the context is how composed she is, gently mourning over the corpse of her first child's body. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I wouldn't nearly be as presentable. I would be wailing, nose dripping, tears flying, eyes bloodshot from not being able to gasp for a breath. As skilled as Michelangelo was at portraying facial emotions, he still chose to represent the Virgin as composed. It's said by Remy Hilawala and Jerome Ormond in their journal article, St. Peter's Pieta, that Michelangelo aesthetically could not bring himself to favor the ugliness of death and the horrors of suffering, which is well within the artist's right. However, it is powerful to represent a subject in what I would argue is an idealistic representation of grief for any mother. The Virgin Mary is often used to set an example or a standard that women ultimately compare themselves to. When it comes to the ideal woman, Guadalupe is often an example to recognize and adopt for people, in particular women, and further than that, Catholic women. We see an example of this impeccable standard in the oil painting Castas by Luis Mena. The casta system is represented through a series of paintings that literally chart the people of New Spain from the 17th to the 18th century, based on the purity of their blood, meaning how much Spanish blood did an individual have compared to indigenous or African blood. A pure blood is an Español or an Española. One with only indigenous blood is an Indio or an India. The product of an Español and an India produces a mestizo, someone with half blood of each. However, an Español with a mestiza can produce a castizo, meaning someone with more than half Spanish blood, which was considered more desirable. It becomes more complex when gender and color was taken into consideration. But in general, the more Spanish blood an individual had, the higher on the chart they were. However, if you thought people were only judged by the color of their skin, you were mistaken. In fact, it does get worse. According to Magali M. Carrera in her journal, Locating Race in Colonial Mexico, she explains how a New Spain woman that is pale like an Española, but with traits such as textured hair, accent, lack of education, can bring down her value and therefore her place in the casta system. Yet if an Española met all these standards, there's one thing she could never achieve, and that is the quality of the Guadalupe. She sits at the top center of the casta painting above. as there is no better place for the Virgin in Mina's eyes. In fact, with a closer look, a majority of the figures of Spanish descent have their gaze on the Virgin above, while none of those with indigenous or African blood appear to see her. Perhaps those that do not see the Virgin are less capable or less associated with salvation presented by the Virgin Mary. Her standard was considered unattainable even by the Spanish that used her as a perfect example for a daughter, wife, and mother, something all women should strive to be in the eyes of the 18th century church. Guadalupe, as presented by the Europeans, appears to hold a divine example, but once she is part of a narrative in a positive portrayal with an Indio by the name of Juan Diego, she is brought down to earth, literally. Now, the story of Juan Diego goes, Guadalupe first appears to him in 1531 at the top of Tepeyac Hill, what is now Mexico City, and was formerly a sanctuary to the Aztec goddess Tonantzin. To prove to the archbishop of the church he saw her apparition, she instructed him to pluck the out-of-season flowers, place them in his tilma, a working-class poncho, and once he dropped the flowers in front of the archbishop, Guadalupe allowed her own likeness to appear on the face of the tilma through the grace of God. The tilma is framed in the Basilica de Guadalupe in Mexico to this day. Despite this divine intervention, Diego is not considered a legitimate saint by the church, as Eric Wolf informs his readers in his piece, The Virgin of Guadalupe. This story and artwork is significant because until Diego, Guadalupe seemed untouchable. But at last there she was, side by side with someone that was Indio. Now it would be an important part to introduce Jeanette Peterson's findings in The Virgin of Guadalupe, symbol of conquest or liberation. Peterson suspects that the narrative of Juan Diego derived from the Spanish in an effort to erase paganism, which was still prominent in the 17th century. She came to this conclusion with a few key pieces of information, first being that the Spanish did not bring the image of Guadalupe into New Spain until 35 years after conquest, that being 1556, which means Juan Diego could have not recognized her in 1531, like the narrative says. Another important point is how there's no evidence to suggest the accounts of Juan Diego existed prior to 1648. Now, this does not mean that there is no writing or word of mouth story ever prior to this date. However, from what evidence is left behind, not even the Archbishop himself made any documentation about the Indio who had seen Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. This is further evidence to suggest that Juan Diego may have been a way to familiarize Indios with a Spanish approach to religion and society. Earlier, I mentioned that Guadalupe also goes by the name Tonantzin. This name is still used in some parts of Mexico today, according to Wolf. This was originally the name of the Aztec goddess with a shrine on Tepeyac Hill. Thus, placing the story of Juan Diego and Guadalupe on the hill, dedicated to a pagan god, could have been a probable tactic used by the Spanish to overwrite the previous icon in the process. This created a bridge between the Indios, especially those that worship Aztec gods, and Catholicism, inevitably uniting the two for centuries to come. However, Guadalupe was not only used for religious gain, she was a symbol for political propaganda too. Wolf points out that Guadalupe satisfies the hope for life compared to Christ satisfying the fascination of death in New Spain. For example, the very apparition of Guadalupe helped Juan Diego seek salvation and lived a better life after, where he conformed properly, appeasing the church. Wolf argues that, quote, the myth of the apparition served as a symbolic testimony that the Indian, as much as the Spaniard, was capable of being saved and capable of receiving Christianity. In Wolf's terms, this supports the idea that Catholic conversion, quote, validates the Indian's right to legal defense, orderly government, and to citizenship, to supernatural salvation, but also to salvation from random oppression. In short, the lives of the converted Indios had more benefit compared to those that still practiced paganism. At least this was a narrative as painted by the Spanish, but it became a reality in the governing system. Guadalupe helped guide the masses of New Spain into becoming a Christian-ruled society. So why did I bombard you all with such detailed information? Well, I found a parallel in how Guadalupe was a symbol of ideal behavior and survival, which was still true in the 20th century and onward. The efforts of the Spanish allowed Guadalupe to still be a prominent figure today in contemporary in contemporary Mexican and Mexican-American artworks. For example, Guadalupe remains an inspiration to artists like Yolanda Lopez and her notable piece, the Guadalupes. Yolanda Lopez's piece stood out to me because she uses a triptych, a 3-panel painting commonly used as an altarpiece in religious settings, to replace the Guadalupe with 3 other women: her mother in the center, her grandmother on the left, and herself on the right. Betty LeDuc, in her article Breaking Chicano Stereotypes, describes how Lopez claims she simply transformed the Guadalupe as she was known to society, because in her personal life she sees her family's feminine generations as the ideal, instead of the narrative of the Spanish conquistadores brought to the Americas centuries prior. Her mother is depicted sewing the robe of Guadalupe to show how hard she works, putting the love into every stitch. Her grandmother is depicted sitting on Guadalupe's robe with a knife and a snake in hand, like that on the Mexican flag, to show how she provided for the family. And finally, the artist herself is depicted running toward the viewer with the robe of Guadalupe as a cape, while holding a snake in her hand as a metaphorical motion toward the future change for generations to come. This is one of the ways we see idealistic behavior and cultural survival, as mentioned before. Lopez also believed Guadalupe was transformed from Coatlicue, meaning Lady of the Snake Skirt. Coatlicue was an Aztec goddess who, like Guadalupe, had an immaculate conception where feathers fell upon her lap and she became pregnant. Because this ancient goddess can transform into Guadalupe, Lopez too can transform this Christian figure to what she believes is best. Does this finally make Guadalupe attainable? Lopez created a version of Guadalupe that is realistic for her to meet the expectations of. A trinity of the Guadalupe were used in a method that supported Lopez's respect for the figure and the culture that holds Catholicism in high regards. The next supporting piece will be the controversial 1999 digital print Our Lady by Amal Lopez. Those of you unaware of the background of this piece, allow me to explain. When Amal Lopez's piece went on display in 2001 in Santa Fe's Museum of International Folk Art, the Catholic community was outraged. In fact, Nancy Warren, in her 2001 SFGate article, Some Like a Virgin, Some Don't, would cover how the public had outburst into threats and protest. Warren also quoted the Archbishop Michael Sheehan, accusing Lopez of portraying La Virgen as a tart and calling for it to be taken down from the museum. Lopez argued her intentions were not lewd or offensive and chose to represent her subjects with her fellow feminists, Raquel Salinas as Our Lady and Raquel Gutierrez as Young Jesus. Like Yolanda Lopez, Lopez was simply showing a realistic version of Guadalupe that matched with her own lived experience and exercised a means to express her sexuality in an appreciative and non-pornographic way. She used the familiarity of Guadalupe to represent her own truth as a Chicana lesbian feminist artist. Gisela La Torre, in her journal article, Icons of Love and Devotion, Amal Lopez's Art, argues that Lopez has challenged the exclusion and or erasure of female agency within the conventional Mexican and Chicano nationalist imagery. La Torre continues to suggest that Lopez's background as an LA-bound Chicana lesbian contributes to her unique interpretation of the Guadalupe to incorporate a modern approach. Now, there is a major difference between the contemporary artists mentioned versus the older artists covered in the previous centuries. That difference would be that the 20th century artists I covered are women. Notably, women have a unique relationship to Guadalupe because she serves as a role model. This is represented in contemporary artworks that don't always fit the church's guidelines. This response to a female figure that is heavily associated with perfection is a way for 20th century female artists to express the changes that come with the generations. For definitions such as femininity, and what it means to be a woman are rapidly changing. Through the centuries, Guadalupe has been used as an example, whether that be to represent a feminine ideal, a religious principle, political means, or a cultural reinterpretation. Guadalupe, as portrayed in contemporary works, pushes the bounds of the silent and submissive women as typically told by centuries of history from the perspective of the church. Michelangelo and Minna may have shown the world a perfect Virgin Mary, but Yolanda Lopez and Amal Lopez have pushed the traditional bounds unintentionally of this iconographic figure to meet a realistic set of inadvertent standards set from the previous centuries. Yolanda Lopez gives us a Guadalupe that can be seen in everyone across generations, while Amal Lopez gives us a Guadalupe not typically represented. After all, there are not many lesbian Chicana feminist saints to go around. Her image has been replicated so much that she is still recognized with the same likeness that appeared on Juan Diego's tilma in the 16th or 17th century. The effects of colonialism are still visible through the response of these artists, since Catholicism shaped the structure of South America and some parts of North America by bringing in pivotal figures like the Guadalupe. She has endured the test of time and societal values to remain relevant as an important feminine role model. Guadalupe has come a long way across oceans and centuries to be reinterpreted through the eyes of Mexican-American contemporary artists as represented today. Thank you so much for listening and walking through the centuries with me.
Thank you so much. All right, so if I can invite both of our panelists up. So you think of your